Because of his constant attacks on the value-free positivism of a major strand of legal realism, Cohn has not often been thought of as a realist, but once we realize that there was in fact a major debate within realism over its tendencies toward ethical positivism, we not only are able to place Cohn directly within the legal realist tradition, we also come to see that among the major opponents of positivism, Jews clearly dominated the intellectual agenda. There were no Jews, except perhaps Sheldon Gluck, among the group that defined legal realism in terms of behavioral social sciences. In 1919, in the pages of the New Republic, Morris Cohn attacked Zionism on Enlightenment universalist grounds. A national Jewish Palestine must necessarily mean a state founded on a peculiar race, a tribal religion, and a mystic belief in a peculiar soil, he wrote. Whereas liberal America stands for separation of church and state, the free mixing of races, and the fact that men can change their habitation and language and still advance the process of civilization. He was convinced that no great civilization was ever achieved except by a mixed people freely borrowing from others in religion, language, law, and manners. The policy of assimilation was clearly expressed by Spinoza, said Morris Cohn, who pointed out that Jews, like other groups, are held together by the bond of common suffering, and that as the nations became enlightened and removed their restrictions against the Jews, the latter would adopt the habits of Western civilization, and the problem would thus be eliminated. Unfortunately, he conceded, restrictions against Jews have nowhere been completely removed. This in turn made the intellectual Jews particularly susceptible to the mystic and romantic nationalism which began in Germany as a reaction against liberalism of the French Revolution, against the old faith in the power of cosmopolitan reason and enlightenment which overthrew medievalism. Incidentally, the idealistic Zionists are quite willing to ignore the rights of the vast majority of the non-Jewish population of Palestine, quite like the Teutonic idealists with their superior culture. As Suzanne Klingenstein concludes in her excellent book, Jews in the American Academy, 1900 to 1940, Cohn's faith in the Enlightenment as a means of salvation and its power to solve the Jewish problem through its policy of assimilation was absolute. She contrasts Cohn's position with that of the Zionist Jewish philosopher Horace Kallen, about whom we'll certainly hear more from Dahlia Tzu, who claimed that the nationalist philosophy of Zionism is an extension of the assumptions of liberalism from the individual to the group. The nationalism, which is only another name for the rights of freedom of thought and of association, was a development of, not a reaction against, the spirit of the French Revolution. Kallen's arguments were important in persuading Louis Brandeis to join the Zionist cause. Only late in life, Klingenstein concludes, did Cohn soften his hostility to Jewish particularism, though until the day of his death, he opposed political Zionism as a form of tribalism. Yet Klingenstein continues, closer examination of Cohn's philosophy reveals the amazing, though upon further reflection not too surprising, fact that his reasoning was governed by the same concern as that of his two colleagues, Horace Kallen and Harry Wilson, who was professor of Jewish history at Harvard. Jewish philosophers who did not retreat in the kind of abstract universalism that Morris Cohn's son Felix denounced as transcendental nonsense. Like them, she concludes, Morris Cohn's thought was characterized by an almost anxious attempt to strike and keep the balance between extremes. Wolfson and Kallen, in their endeavors to find a balance between apparent polarities, created new third units such as the community of philosophers or the consent community in America. But Cohen's solution to the problem of being Jewish in America, she said, consists in nothing but the precise philosophical formulation of the problem itself, and in his principle of polarity, In a word, the principle of polarity structured Cohn's effort, as he put it, to find and defend the virtuous middle way, which Klingenstein calls cosmopolitanism. Cohn, she tells us, never had belonged anywhere for a sustained period of time during his childhood and youth. Using a familiar strategy, he appears to have made a virtue of such detachment. As an adult, he intensely distrusted the concrete, the sensual, and the active. This means the means for gaining equipoise and keeping the balance between polar extremes were logic and reason. In this final formulation, I believe Klingenstein hasn't carried her insight about Cohn's alienation far enough. The present wave of nominalism in juristic science, Cohn wrote, Morris Cohn, in 1931, is a reaction by younger men against the abuse of abstract principles by an older generation that neglected the adequate factual analysis necessary to make principles properly applicable. In this observation, Cohn reveals his sympathy with the criticisms of reification of concepts that his son Felix was to formulate so brilliantly in Transcendental Nonsense 4 years later. It reveals his own recognition of the tension between the general and the particular, the abstract and the concrete, the universal and the particular. That was one of the driving forces of realist criticism. Indeed, Cohn's two greatest contributions to realist thought, his essays Property and Sovereignty and The Basis of Contract, 1927-1933, were each studies in the problem of the general and the particular. Both essays sought to deconstruct, in our language, the sharp separation between public and private, between a public realm of sovereignty and coercion and a private realm of voluntary exercise of rights. Cohn sought to show in typical realist fashion that these distinctions were differences of degree, not of kind. It was equally possible, he wrote in The Basis of Contract, to conceive of contract as a delegation of public power to private individuals to use in the public interest. It was also equally possible to think of property in terms of power and coercion instead of voluntariness and natural rights, and to conceive of sovereignty as consent or the vindication of natural rights. But above all, the institution of property was not a mirror of Lockean pre-political rights. It was a social creation designed to achieve social purposes. Here, Cohn was drawn into the cognitive relativist critique of categories as socially constructed. In Europe, it would seem the conflict between universalism and particularism in social thought unfolded as a conflict between, on the one hand, the claims of first religion and then of value-free social science to universalism, and on the other, the particularizing deconstructive strategies of cognitive relativism. In America, by contrast, where moralism was never associated with the old regime, the conflict between the general and particular took place around efforts to mediate between essentialist claims of moralism and the anti-essentialist method implicit in cognitive relativism. If we are to understand the place of the diaspora Jewish intellectuals, we need to understand the structure of the conflict and the specific ways in which they sought to wrestle with the problem. One of the most fertile areas for studying this conflict is the efforts of Jewish legal realists, who were also the first generation of American cognitive relativists to confront this problem. Thank you.